Hey everybody, Phil here. This video is called Estimating Hand Frequencies, and perhaps some of you have been looking forward to this because I've referenced at least a couple times now throughout this course, and I will reference many more times in the future of this course, figuring out how often our opponent has certain hand classes and how often we have certain hands. The way to go about doing that is a two-step process. The first step is a pretty boring one. It's basically learn, know, memorize how often you're dealt different hand classes. And we'll get into that in a moment. The second is, once you have that information in your mind, you take the action that has been taken in the hand, either by your opponent and yourself, or actually usually both, and determine how often those hand classes would have played in that way compared to how often your range would have played in that way. So for example, if I have a certain hand class 5% of the time and I check, and I'm checking 50% of my range, and I check that hand 50% of the time, I still have it 5% of the time because I've got now 2.5 of that hand in my 50% range, which turns into 5% of the overall range. But of course, if I've checked all of that hand class in my 50% range, now it's doubled to be 10% of my full range. So let's start by getting you the data, the facts, and you can start memorizing. Okay, so let's look at some of the most important hand categories, hand classes, and work our way down to the ones that are not that important, but you may as well know. So starting with flushes, depending on, flushes and flush draws, depending on how many of that suit are on the board and how many board cards have hit, it's going to range somewhere between like 19 and 21% of your dealt frequency. That is, hands that you were dealt pre-flop. Obviously, some of those get folded, so when you play a hand, it actually goes up. And depending on the flush cards that come out, if they're high flush cards, maybe it goes back down to like 20%. If they're low flush cards and you've played a lot of high suited hands, maybe it goes up to 23% or something like that. But the rough idea to have in mind is that you're going to have a flush draw or be dealt a flush draw 20-ish% of the time, or a flush 20-ish% of the time. I don't think it's at all important to get as precise as 19 versus 22% for the purposes of using this, especially in game. So moving on to straights and straight draws. Again, these are going to be like 7.5%-ish. And you can use these, by the way, for any two-card combos. I don't know why you would want to, but let's say on 9-8-7, you have about 7.5% Jack-10 dealt to you. You also have about 7.5% King-Queen dealt to you. You don't really care how often you have King-Queen, but it's the same. It's basically two cards not on the board. Now, when these start to overlap, so let's say on that same 9-8-7, and you want to think of how often your opponent has a straight, well, there are three straights out there, right? There are, 9-8-6. So Jack-10, 10-6, and 6-5. And obviously sometimes you'll have Jack-10-6 or 10-6-5. So when you count all the overlap, it's going to get close to 20%, 19.5, 20% for all three. I like to use 7% to simplify for each, and then I just add them up so that the overlap is kind of taken into account. So I think two of them is about 14, and then when you add the third, it goes down to 20. But I just use 7% for each two-card combo not on the board. Again, dealt. So if the board is ace-5-3, where deuce-4 is the straight, a lot of people fold deuce-4 pre-flop in a lot of scenarios, so that number is going to be lower. And of course, if somebody's 3-bet, and now the flop is queen-jack-10, well, they have more ace-king than 7%, than 7.5%. They have, I don't know if it's 10, 12%. With flush draws, I do know that a 3-betting range has, instead of 20% flush draws, has 30% flushes and flush draws. And you can look in Vision or in Monk or Solver, whatever you use to determine, which of these, if you want to drill down further than I have, which I haven't, I know that for flush draws, but I don't actually know exactly how often a 3-betting range has Jack-8 in it. If you want to do that, you can. It's pretty easy to look at. So moving on to trips. Trips is a pretty important one. Trips, when there's a pair out on the board, whether it be the flop or turn, gets to roughly 15% that you're dealt that trips. And I view that as an important one because I think people really underestimate how often people have trips. So for example, if, let's say hypothetically, your opponent doesn't have a raising range and you go with a bet sizing strategy of like third pot on flop. Let's say you 3-bet. You go third pot on flop, half pot on turn or something, and they fold it. Actually, they get to overfold flop. So let's say they fold like 40% of their range on the flop. They fold another 40% on the turn. Well, now that 15%, I made the math harder than I should have, but that 15% is up, like in the high 30s, I would think by now. No, maybe even low 40s. So like they have trips a lot by that point, and that doesn't even count boats, like with other cards that are not trips. It counts boats with that board card. So on, 7-7 4 deuce, 4 deuce, or sorry, 7-4 and 7 deuce are counted in the trips, so 15% dealt. But 4-4 and deuce deuce are not. So they actually, by the time they call down, like on these paired boards, people have trips plus a lot. So be careful. Similarly, you have trips a lot when you call down on those boards. So if you feel like you're getting run over on those boards and you're just folding river, then you're like, man, I need to start making these calls with whatever non-trips hand it is. Don't worry that much. You have a lot of trips. Maybe you've been running bad and you haven't had it, or maybe the fact that your opponent is not bluffing enough means that they always have trips in their hand. So there's only one of them left for you to have, and so you just don't have it that often because they block it. Speaking of, fours and deuces on the 7-7 4 deuce board, sets and pocket pairs in general. So you're going to be dealt a pocket pair about 3% of the time. And then once that pair hits on the board, you're going to have it about 1.5% of the time. It gets cut in half. Again, of course, changes a lot in a 3-betting range. 3-betting range has a lot of ace-ace, a lot of king-king, and actually quite a bit of, queen-queen and jack-jack as well, and 10-10. So those high pairs, the numbers go way up once somebody's 3-bet. But 3% dealt, 1.5% once there's one out there on the board. So you don't run into sets nearly as often as you run into trips. So for 2-pair, of course, meaning 2-pair on the board, so King Jack 7-4, hand like King 4 individually, you're going to have roughly 4% of the time. It's going to be a little bit higher than that, but I just use 4. Again, I'm trying to make this math easy for myself to do away from the table and at the table. So I just use 4% for each of those. Of course, there's a little bit of overlap, but that's actually why I go to 4 instead of like the 4.3% that it is, because if I want to figure out, okay, on King Jack 4, how often does my opponent have 2-pair? Well, it's 4 plus 4 plus 4. It's 12, which actually is going to get you to roughly the right answer because of the overlap, even though the true right answer might be closer to 13 if there were no overlap. That does it for like what I would say are the important categories. So in the unimportant category, so if you want to know how often you are dealt a single pair or better, so let's say like a king, how often are you dealt a king pre-flop? It's 28% of the time. You're also dealt a 4 pre-flop 28% of the time. Now, once one of those is on board, it gets closer to about 23%. And then similarly, if you want to figure out how often somebody has a card that's not on the board, so on a board of ace, jack, 10, 9, how often does somebody have a king? It's about 30%, because those are anti-blockers effectively. That covers everything as far as categories that I use when I'm breaking down hands and trying to figure out how often my opponent has different things, how often I have different things. So now let's get back into how to use that. So once you have those things down, it's not that many things to remember. I'm pretty bad at memorization, so if I can do it, you can do it. The way you use it is you take a look at, as I've alluded to already, how your opponent has played the hand, how you've played the hand, and how they would have played certain hand classes. So the kind of technical right way to do it is the example I gave earlier in the video, which is, okay, so my opponent has checked. I know that they check 50%, and they check this, like they check top 2 pair, only 20% of the time. So that 4% now gets cut to like 0.8%, which as part of a 50% checking range is 1.6%. So they have top 2 pair 1.6% of the time. You don't need to get that precise, but I'm not playing right now, so I can do that. That's the technically correct way to do it. The way I like to do it, because keep in mind, this is, eventually this is for you to use in game. And as I've been harping on, you don't want to use too much of your mental bandwidth. So the way that I do it is I just say, okay, so I know that they have a flush 20% of the time or so. Let's call it 22 because of pre-flop, but 20-ish. Have they played the hand in a way where they would have more flushes or less flushes? Do they play flushes this way more often than their range or less often than their range? And then by how much? So I'm getting very rough guesses as to things. And some ways where you can get very good guesses there, especially on flush boards, actually, because people don't do much raising on flush boards, is let's say you've raised pre-flop, you get called. Monotone flop, check. You bet quarter pot, they call. Let's say they do that with, 75% of their range. So now they're 20, what is that? Let's just say their 20% goes up to like, I don't know, I'm going to do it wrong, but like 27-ish. And then you pot turn, and now you know that they need to fold half their range, but they're never folding a flush, never fold. They're not supposed to fold a flush. So you pot turn. Now they have a flush 52% of the time. So 50 to 55% of the time on the river. Like that's one of the easiest ways to do it is when people are defending, hands get narrowed down very quickly, or the math is easier because, they're usually defending roughly half their range against a large bet. And if there's a hand class that they're never folding, but not raising too often, then it just doubles roughly. Now, of course, sometimes they raise. So sometimes on like a one straight board, they're interesting examples of, let's say the flop is king 5-3. They check. You bet big. They call. Now turn is a 7. So king 5-7-3. They check. You pot. They call. That's a spot where a lot of straights, 6-4, the only straight, raise. So what was actually let's say, by the time they've called the flop, they have 6-4, instead of 7-ish%, they have it like 12% of the time, maybe 12% of the time they raise it sometime. And then by the time they call pot on the turn, that 12% would go up to 20 to 25%, which is, a reasonable amount. However, which actually, if as we've covered already, if they have 25% straights, you can no longer value bet a set on the river. However, they raise the straight very often, so they're actually going to go from like 12% down usually on the river to something like 8 or 10% because they've raised the straights much more than they raised their overall range, so they're not as many in their calling range. So now all of your sets and even some strong two pair can still value bet that river. That's an example of the way it works. Similarly, another kind of easier way to do it is when your opponent is rarely slow playing a set across 3 streets and they've bet 3 times and you know that they roughly bet like 50% frequency across flop and turn, then you know that on the flop they have 4.5% sets because each is 1.5%. Maybe some of the cards are higher, so you round up to 5% because those are played more pre-flop. Well, now they bet the flop, it's doubled to 10. They bet the turn, it's doubled to 20. You're actually running into a set about 20% of the time on the turn. Not to mention that actually another card turned, and so maybe it's 21% or something. Or by the time they bet 22, 23%, because they don't bet the turn pair very often on the flop. Anyways, that gives you a rough idea of how you do the math in game. And now you have the tools to do it. So you might be asking yourself or me, this seems like it's going to overload my mind in game. Aren't I supposed to be offloading things like this so that I can have high level thinking while I play and think critically about the exact board and the spot and all these things? The answer is yes. I struggled with this a lot at first, very early in my challenges. And I just eventually got good at it. I found it really, really useful when I was studying away from the table to try to make guesses about how often I would run into different hands. Because then when I'm plugging things in Division, I can find out right away. So you could just find out right away by plugging it in Division and seeing how often your opponent has different hands and what you're supposed to do and what they're supposed to do. I like to stop and guess before I do that. I like to stop and guess, okay, I think I should do this. I think they're going to have this hand like I think I'm going to have a better hand 15% of the time or so. And then I check and see if I was right or not. Now, the only part we didn't totally get to, but I've talked about in previous videos, is the most important way to use this, in my opinion, is thinking about how often is my hand beat. So for that, you start at the top. You start with the best hand class and work your way down. So if you're trying to decide if you can value bet river or not, the king 5-3-7 board is a perfect example. Well, okay, I have top 2 pair, king 7, or let's say king 10, river's a 10. How often is that hand beat? Well, like we said, we did it with 6-3. That's something like 10% of the time on the river. And pots are only sizing on the river, so we want to keep it under 20 total. So are there 10% more hands that beat king 10? I would say, okay, well, there's a little bit of king 10, which chops, but that only counts for a couple of percent because it's going to chop anyways, and so you count it as half. But then as far as sets, I mean, if king slow played the flop, which it'll do sometimes, it probably just calls the turn most of the time. So if, let's say, after check calling the flop and not 3-betting pre-flop, it's something like 0.75%. Let's actually start on the flop. So 0.75% of a check call range, let's say, is king, because so many have 3-bet and so many have raised pre-flop, but it's never folding. Let's just call it 1% for easier math. And then 5-5 and 3-3, some of them fold pre, some of them raise flop. Actually, a lot of them raise flop. Less so if it was, let's say, a two-tone board, so there's a flush draw out there. So let's say there was a flush draw out there. Now, let's say that they raise half the time or so. So then we take the 3% for each, only 1.5% left in the calling range, and the calling range is like 40%. So now we've got, a little more than double that. So 3.5% plus the 1% kings, because we kind of did that math separately. So now we have 4.5% on the turn. And let's say, obviously none of them are going to fold the turn. And let's say very few raise, but some raise. So then it almost doubles, I would say, to 8% by the time they check call turn. So now king 10 is beat roughly, let's say, 18% of the time. Now my 6-4 math might be very off, by the way, because I don't know how often 6-4 is raising. It could be that they only have 6-4 like 7% of the time on the river instead of 10, or maybe 5% of the time on the river instead of 10. I don't think it's going to be way, way higher. But regardless, we can see that the math I did says king 10's beat like 18% of the time, maybe chops a couple of percent. So it's right around that 20% threshold, and we can value pot king 10. The math is rough. I'm going to get the wrong answer in game very, very often. But what's important is I'm not value betting in a spot where I get a number of like 35% of the time I'm beat and then I'm potting. Because even if I'm off there and it was actually 25, well, I still shouldn't have potted. So you just want to get close and give it your best shot at deciding if you can bet a hand or not, or deciding how often you think your opponent's going to fold. It's not just, you don't just do this in kind of the theoretically optimal way of figuring out how often you're beat and then value betting a hand that should value bet. You can also think about, okay, well, the way my opponent's played the hand, I think he's got a flush 30% of the time. I think he's never calling without a flush. So let's go for this play. That's a way you can use it as well. Hopefully you found that helpful, not too overwhelming. Again, do this away from the table first. I would not try to do it in game right away. Just do it while you're practicing, do it while you're studying, do it while you're reviewing your own hands. That's I think the best time to do it. And try to come up with the answer before you look it up and find out. I will see you in the next video.